Thank you so much, Hakemitsu. So again, welcome everybody. What I wanted to talk about today, indeed, I'm going to talk about my research on celebrity culture and some of the things I've been studying. But because I have the honor of being here with Takemitsu, who himself, of course, is an expert on sociology of culture, but also in sociological theory. And that is indeed also one of my areas of expertise. So what I want to show is kind of twofold, is what is the connection between celebrity research and sociological theory. And I want to show it both in terms of how is this helpful for understanding what does celebrity mean today, but also to show a little bit on the value, what is the value of sociological theory. I also want to show that there is something specific about studying celebrity sociologically. So by definition, celebrity is something that we all know. I mean, we live in what you could call a celebrity age. It's the celebrity era. Everybody talks about celebrities all the time. That is what celebrity is. But that doesn't mean that we understand it. And it definitely doesn't mean that we understand why is it sociologically relevant. And that is the specific contribution that I seek to make. So let me first say a few words in general about sociological theory. What is the goal of sociology? Is to account for variation in empirical realities. Very, very arcane notion to say that these days, but that's what we're ultimately interested in. So we're interested in studying a particular phenomenon. It could be celebrity, it could be law, it could be crime, and then we're interested in accounting for how does it vary. And what do you see? That there's a connection between theory on the one hand and research on the other. So you begin at a very abstract level, right? You have a particular way of looking at reality. You come up with a particular methodology of thinking, like, Karl Marx was influenced by Hegel and said we can approach reality dialectically, right? And so it's a particular way of looking at reality. And then you study a society and you come up with particular dimensions in a social context that you consider to be relevant. Like for Marx, it would be the economic changes. So economic changes in terms of the mode of production. And that is then your theory. And then you can apply it to a particular reality. Well, is this true or not? So on the one hand, on an abstract level, theory is either valuable or not. And then when it becomes very concrete in research, when we translate theory into testable propositions, it's either true or not. It's either valid or not. So value and validity of theory. So I'm going to bring that out in the case of the study of celebrity. And what I find very important is the following, which I always explain very carefully to my students. That is, when we talk about a theory in sociology, we talk about a particular approach. How do we study society sociologically? And we talk about theory as a particular proposition about the main driving force in any society at any point in time. So I'm going to just briefly explain that with reference to an example. So let's look at the classics, Marx, Weber, Durkheim. And it is useful at least to explain different modes of doing sociological theory and indeed of doing sociology. But what I find very important indeed is that distinction between sociological approach and theory of society. And if you look at the table, look at the first two rows. So we have, in terms of the columns, we have the three scholars. In terms of the row, the top row is the sociological approach. So the top row is how should you study society. So for Marx, it's a dialectical approach. For Weber, it's all about verstehen. I'm sure Dr. Morikawa told you that many times, right? It's about verstehen. It's an interpretive approach oriented at understanding. And for Durkheim, it's about explanation in terms of cause and function. So it's a study of social facts. So you see, that is at the level at which sociological theory is about studying society in a particular way. At the next level, we have the theory in terms of theory of society. A materialist theory, then what I would call a multi-dimensional theory for Weber, elective affinity, Wahlverwandtschaft, right? And then the idealism, the cultural perspective of Emil Durkheim, see? And I find that very important to make that distinction because I think those issues tend to be conflated. But it's important to make this distinction. Then, why do we study culture sociologically? So what is the difference between, for instance, cultural studies, humanities, and a sociology of culture? What is specific about sociology? You study culture not as such, you study culture in society. You study law in society. So in other words, you always study whatever it is that you're interested in with reference to its relationship with other dimensions of society. Like I just actually said, you were all nodding, which is very good, because it's the beginning of sociological. I said, yeah, you can study law and culture, law in relationship to culture, which obviously means to what extent does culture inform law, but in turn also to what extent does law have effects on culture. See? And so this relationship between culture and other social dimensions is what is specific about sociology of law. Now, why is culture an important theme in sociology? In the theoretical sense, is Emil Durkheim, whose work you very briefly see here, right? The key difference in the transformation to modernity for Durkheim is cultural. So we have the transition from a mechanical to an organic society, which, among other characteristics, means the change from a society that is held together by strong common beliefs to a society that has diversity in beliefs driven by increasing individualism and a loss in the influence of tradition. So in other words, weakening influence of tradition, increase in individualism in beliefs leads to diversity in society. So in other words, for somebody like Durkheim, society is very fundamentally culturally driven. The centrality of culture is not restricted only to the work of Durkheim. We can also look at some of the other great thinkers in classical theory, in modern theory, and in contemporary theory. So there is definitely a centrality of culture in sociology and in sociological theory. If we think about Max Weber, a very important study for Weber was the Protestant ethic, right? The spirit of capitalism, which was basically an inversion of Marx, right? He says one of the influences, not the only one, but one of the influences of the development of capitalism, which in this case is not a mode of production, but a type of conduct, efficiency-oriented action in the economic sphere, is driven by values, Protestant values, Protestant values of hard work that have to do with salvation and so on, right? So there's the role of ideas in Weber. Second, as a modern example, so modern sociology is defined as sociology after the classics, basically after World War II. The second most famous example is Talcott Parsons, who borrowed a lot, who wrote his famous study on the structure of social action, which basically argues that all the leading thinkers were drifting towards this voluntaristic model, where culture is important. And, it's obviously Parsons who brought that into American sociology. So the influence of culture in Durkheim, the influence of ideas in Max Weber, and indeed, he neglected Marx, who didn't fit that model at all, of course. And so for Parsons, what became important was the relevance of shared values in a society. Now, if we then move from modern to contemporary theory, so let's say for me, contemporary is late 20th century, right? I'm probably a little older than some of you, right, than the students are, right? But for me, contemporary is late 20th century until today. Then we have somebody like Jürgen Habermas from Germany who kind of agrees with this, who agrees with the fact that culture, that communicative action, that language, that all these kind of issues have been neglected in Marxism, in traditional Marxist models. Good. I can briefly define culture. Nothing too spectacular about it. So we refer to culture as the whole of values, ideas in a society. They are mediated in a symbolic form. That is actually very important, because it's, let's say, it is unique to the human experience that we have culture in that sense. There's besides our species that can communicate in linguistic forms, you will not find any examples of culture in that sense, and it is then expressed in certain material products. What is also important, but these are by now fairly, I would say, accepted ideas. That is, that when we talk about culture, generally I always talk about values. But within culture, we can talk about popular culture. So I went from sociological theory, right, to sociology of culture. Now within culture, we talk about popular culture. By definition, what is popular culture? Believe it or not, it is popular. It is something that involves large segments of the population. There's a quantitative aspect to differentiating popular culture from culture at large, but there is also a qualitative aspect. Now let's look at it how sociologists have traditionally studied popular culture, and indeed, like I already kind of indicated right before, is that when we look generally at the early history of sociology, we do not always see that much attention to culture, but whenever there is attention to it, it tends to be on what you could call traditional culture. So culture that has roots, culture that has been around for a long time. Religion is obviously discussed a lot. And when we look conversely at the sociological study of popular culture, we see that generally it's been neglected. Once it becomes studied, it's typically reduced to a commodity. So it is frowned upon, like I said before. The most important representative in this kind of a perspective to treat popular culture, yes, but to reduce it to, let's say, a minor form of entertainment to something that fulfills other functions is the work by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. The Dialectic of Enlightenment, maybe you know this work. It was published actually during World War II in English, and it features a chapter called The Culture Industry, and it's about mass deception. And actually, do you see the little graphic? I made that little graphic, so better congratulate me, because it exemplifies indeed what they are thinking. So to the, what is this? To the left, you see Horkheimer, and to the right, that is the other bald, I want to say the bald guy, they're both bald, and the other guy, that is Adorno, and then the other black and white picture in the background is Marx. And who are they talking about indeed? So it is Horkheimer and Adorno use the work of Marx to talk about a little cartoon figure who is Mickey Mouse, because indeed what is one of the culture aspects of American culture industry is Disney. Right? You know, Walt Disney, the cartoons, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, that was what they understood to be popular culture. But basically we have two competing models. So on the one hand, you have this neo-Marxist perspective, whereby popular culture is dismissed as inauthentic, as lacking aesthetic qualities, as, you know, it doesn't stimulate people. It kind of, let's say, it drugs them. You know, like it pacifies them. It keeps them quiet. It's like you're watching the football game and you eat a big bag of chips and you drink a lot of beer. You know, like it doesn't activate your brain, so to speak, right? That's the Marxist point of view. On the contrary, it subdues you or it pacifies you. So popular culture is reduced to its functions in the political economy, particularly as a commodity. So what is popular culture? It's something that makes money. That's kind of what it is. Right now, obviously, we can talk about that. From a constructionist sociological point of view, popular culture is a dimension of culture. You know, it exists. It cannot a priori be, let's say, diminished, nor should it be elevated. It exists, it can be studied. And the very fact that it's popular doesn't mean it's worthless in and of itself. So there is clearly a certain kind of elitism in Adorno. You know, Adorno had very strange ideas when it came to classical music, including his own music, actually, because he also wrote music. And so, in that sense, what a constructionist perspective will argue is that culture should be taken seriously. That doesn't mean that it is serious. You know, it doesn't mean that it doesn't fulfill certain functions, but it does mean that it is something that can authentically move people. I don't know exactly the terms in Japanese, so you should help me out and tell me if it's different in Japanese. But the word fame in Europe is rooted in antiquity, both Greek and Latin. So you see, if you can see on the PowerPoint, the goddess Fame, is that how it's pronounced? Fame is Greek, or Fama in Latin is a deity associated with gossip and scandalous rumor. So there was a goddess called Fame, but it was the person that is being spoken about, like, you know, rumor, like gossip. So in other words, historically, the word fame has a more negative connotation. Like you don't want to be the person spoken about. Because if they talk about you, like it's bad news. See? So in other words, historically, the word fame is related to what today we would call infamy. He lives in infamy. So infamy is a person who is famous for all the wrong reasons. In that sense, the term celebrity is very different. Because celebrity comes from the word celebrate. To celebrate somebody, which means to bestow honor upon them. And nowadays, in the English language, we use both words, fame and celebrity. Usually we use them interchangeably. Actually, you can either say fame or celebrity, but if we make a distinction, then fame refers to the quality of being well known. So it's a quantitative issue, right? One is famous to some extent, or not, and then celebrity refers to the quality of being known or celebrated for being well known. The distinction is useful in some contexts, not so useful in another. See? So fame, celebrity. Historically, like I said, so it's the same model. Fame and celebrity were neglected, and until today, it tends to be, the most dominant perspective when you talk about fame and celebrity today tends to be reductionist. And that's what I'm going a little bit against. Now go back to sociological theory. The key influence in the sociology of fame and celebrity is C. Wright Mills. This is a very famous modern scholar, an opponent of Talcott Parsons theoretically, and he wrote a famous book called The Power Elite. Have some of you heard of that? This is a very famous study about power in the United States after World War II. And he talked about power as consisting not just of democratic power, but of political power, economic power, and military power. And chapter 4, which not a lot of sociologists know, is actually called the celebrities. So it's very interesting. This is in the 1950s. This is in the 1950s that somebody already wrote about celebrity. What does Mills say? He has a few very good ideas. First of all, Mills defines celebrity in terms of public honor. This is actually something that he got from Max Weber. I'll talk about later what exactly from Weber he got. Mills introduced the notion of the professional celebrity. So even in the 1950s, there were already sociologists who could say there is something like celebrities. And he highlighted the role of mass communication systems. So that is very interesting for today, right? Because if we talk about celebrity today, we indeed think about professional celebrities, like people who are famous because they are famous. Kim Kardashian used to be kind of one of the leading examples in the United States. You know, Kylie Jenner, there are others, I'm sure there are examples like that in Japan. And mass communications, so we tend to think of celebrities in terms of the internet, social media. In the 1950s, somebody already talked about that in terms of the growing influence of radio and television. But what does he also do? Mills, very much influenced by Marx, by Weber, but also by Marx, says he reduces it to a political economy. So another quote is, prestige is the shadow of money and power. So prestige in the case of a celebrity. It's the shadow of money and power. It is public honor, but created from above. It is media articulated power and wealth. Why? Again, the same function, so this is very similar to the reasoning of Horkheimer and Adorno. Celebrities are continuously displayed as a diversion strategy, and it is to afford sensations to the masses. So it is pacification. Basically, in my own work, I break with that perspective, and like I said, I take culture more seriously. Ironically, I do it on the basis of a concept of celebrity and or fame. I'm going to use it interchangeably now. That is also indebted to Max Weber. So I relate to Max Weber's work, and I look at celebrity as a form of honor or prestige, and this goes back to Weber's famous distinction between class status and party. It's a very famous article that Weber wrote where he says we have to make a distinction between people who are of the same class, which has to do basically with wealth, with money, right? That is Marx. But we can also talk about people in terms of power category, power that they share, and then indeed we can talk about them in terms of Stand, of Deutsch, right? In German, status, which is the honor and prestige that they may share. This is very good for, in Weber's work, you have a distinction between economy, politics, and culture. So that's also what Parsons was influenced in. That was all the way it is set up, how I conceptually frame my work. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to, let's say, prove my point by illustration, which I think is a useful method of, nobody has ultimate proof, right? Not even the quantitative scholars, they only have it relative to a particular data set and relative to a particular methodology. But you can also make an argument by illustration, and that's what I'm going to do now. And my argument is basically popular culture, fame, and celebrity can and should be studied sociologically. It makes sense to do that. It makes sense to study popular culture as something that makes sense to the people who participate in it, because it does. People are very involved. So let me do 3 examples from my own research and then always show you how it all makes sense from a particular sociological theory point of view. My most famous research, as the kind doctor just already told you, is my work on the rise of fame of Lady Gaga. So this is something that I began to research in 2010. I'm assuming you all know Lady Gaga, right? Because at another talk I was talking about celebrity, and I mentioned names of people that some of the people in the audience didn't know. I said, well, that is strange. Like Naomi Osaka, you know? There are people studying in Japan that don't know Naomi Osaka. They are not Japanese students. They are foreign students. I still thought it was very strange. I thought everybody would know who that is. This is Lady Gaga, who's been around now for a little while, right? It's called Lady Gaga and the Sociology of Fame. Came out in 2017. So, but I started studying it in 2010. Actually taught a course about Lady Gaga called Lady Gaga and the Sociology of Fame. I guess some of the students now are too young to know this, but this got a lot of attention. This actually established my early fame in the Sociology of Fame. This is the original description. The class was called Lady Gaga and the Sociology of Fame. The course was announced in the late summer of 2010, and I started teaching it in 2011. When it was announced, there was an article published in my university's student newspaper. So as you can imagine, that got some attention. But then what happened was, it got picked up by other newspapers. And as you can see here, this is in November 2010, so this is a month later. This is a Google, do you know Google News? So I go to Google News and I type in Lady Gaga, and it was the #1 story about Lady Gaga, was the fact that there was going to be this new class, which I hadn't even taught yet. In fact, I hadn't even really prepared it much yet. I didn't even know exactly how I was going to discuss it. So it became the #1 news story. What a lot to do had it was not so much that article in the student newspaper, but this article. This article about my class was published in the New York Times. So, you know, the New York Times is like the leading newspaper in the United States. And then it also got picked up by the BBC News, and it was on the website of the BBC, and then it mushroomed from there, and then it got all over the news. Then I was interviewed on television. So here you see me, split screen with people on NBC News, and this is ABC news stations that wanted to talk about it. But you know, my celebrity was very short-lived. You know, it was only a couple of months, and then, you know, by now most people have forgotten about it. So, but it's become this curiosity. But it got a lot of attention. Some of that attention, I'm pleased to say, was here in Japan. Well, guess what? In this famous course that everybody was talking about, I use a lot of sociological theory. And besides what I already told you, like, you know, I relate to the work of Max Weber, I obviously contrast myself with the work of Mills. I also rely on Berger and Luckmann, the social construction of reality, a very famous theoretical study. I also rely on Jürgen Habermas, his work on the structural transformation on the public sphere, to talk about media and audience. So there is indeed a sociology of law chapter in my book on Lady Gaga. And why is law, again, very important today when it comes to popular culture, such as music, is that because entertainment today is less material, not more. It is less material, so that whatever rights that are associated, for instance, with music become more important. For this, I rely on the sociological theory of Donald Black, whom maybe some of you will know. He is more known in sociology of law, but Donald Black basically has a theory which he calls the social geometry of law. It's like, how does law behave relative to certain conditions? So that is one example. Here I give you a few concrete examples. Lady Gaga was sued over her fundraising effort for Japan. This was after the tsunami. And then Lady Gaga was selling the bracelet that you see on the screen there. And she sold that bracelet, and the profits would go to Japan. She was being sued by a company, not by Japan, not by the Japanese government, not by somebody acting on behalf of Japan, by a company which had the phone number 1-800 law firm. So in other words, it was clearly a company of lawyers that was out to get some attention. So you think, well, this is a frivolous lawsuit, you know? Because in the United States, you can sue anybody all the time, right? We call it a frivolous lawsuit, right? But guess what? They won that lawsuit. And Gaga had to pay $100,000 to settle this lawsuit. And the reason is that she also charged money for shipping and handling. See, so she sold the bracelet, and she said all the profits go to Japan. And they said, no, because you also charge for shipping and handling, and she had to. So she lost that case, you know, so you see how attractive to you is, and maybe you're gonna win. There have been other cases like that. Doing another couple of examples, because this is what I'm studying now, right? It's law and popular culture in Japan and how it differs with the United States. Japanese pop star Mayu Tomita, do you know her? Some years ago, this was in 2019, she sued the government for inaction after a stalker stabbed her 60 times. So in other words, she's suing over the fact, you know, she's so famous that something has to be done. This is a lawsuit that involves a win for one of the one of the Japanese idols. You know, the Japanese idols, they have particular contract with companies, and one of the stipulations of that contract is that they cannot have romantic relations with fans. And that involves this case. This involves the name of a Japanese pop star. So her name is Rina Ayuchi. Her name was given to her. This is not her real name, it's her artist name. And she had the artist name when she worked for this company. Now she's not with the company anymore, but she still wants to use the name. She actually won that case as well. This is a very interesting case. Do you know who this is? Some of you? No? This is a person who committed suicide. She was a professional wrestler called Hana Kimura. She committed suicide, and it was argued that she committed suicide as a result of bullying against her. And somebody indeed was brought to court over bullying against her, and he was found responsible, but the penalty was a fine. So he got fined 9,000 yen for bullying somebody who committed suicide. So this is kind of strange, right? Because it's a very low penalty, right? But since then the law has changed. And so the cyberbullying sanction now in Japan also includes possible jail time. So that's a very interesting example as well. Then finally, celebrity activism. So celebrity activism has increased tremendously in the United States since COVID-19, since the pandemic, but it was already on the increase before. Here I have a theory, I wrote about this, so this is published. All this research here is published, and this is my most recent research, all of which got published just the past year, is about who becomes the successful celebrity activist. And for this, I rely on theories like Irving Goffman, who talks about impression management. I rely on Robert Merton in terms of manifest and latent functions. And I rely on the work of Howard Becker in terms of motivated and unmotivated action. And let me just do that by example. So here you see some of the celebrities that were involved during the pandemic. There was a lot to do about this. There were celebrity activities like every day in the first year of the pandemic. They had to do with the pandemic itself. Like the celebrities would say, make sure you wear a mask, make sure you stay at home, make sure you get vaccinated. But it also turned towards racial justice activism because of the police killing of George Floyd. And then it turned to mental health activism. And that is what I'm doing now. So if you want to know my most recent paper, which is forthcoming at a sociology meeting in August in the United States, is about Naomi Osaka, who talks a lot about mental health and who promotes mental health awareness, who herself says, you know, I've been struggling with mental health. And for that, I actually rely theoretically on a famous paper by Howard Becker called Becoming a Marijuana User. And our paper is called Becoming a Mental Health Advocate. And what he talks about is that action can be unmotivated. Good? So to conclude, I hope I have shown to you a little bit of the value of studying popular culture sociologically, of the role of sociological theory in studying this, and also, and particularly I would say, of the role of sociological theory in studying concrete societies located in space and time. And the background to all of this is the following, is that I assume, and I would argue, that the 21st century is the century of culture. So if we talk about the 19th century, we can talk about capitalism, economy. If we talk about the 20th century, we have to talk about World War I, World War II. We can talk about democratization. We can talk about new countries that are being formed. But if we want to talk about the 21st century, I really think that we have to take culture very, very seriously, more so than ever before. Okay? Well, thank you very much. If you're interested in more from my work, you can find it online. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.